I still remember the trip where I thought I was prepared for anything. I had a brand new backpack, a shiny new stove, a first aid kit that could patch up half a battlefield, 2 flashlights, spare batteries, a hatchet, a multi-tool, an extra multi-tool just in case, rope, a camp chair, a folding saw, 3 different types of fire starters, and about 15 other gadgets I convinced myself I'd definitely need. 20 essentials in all, laid out neatly on my garage floor before the trip. My buddy Dave, who had been camping with me for years, just shook his head and said, "You'll end up using 3 of those." I laughed him off, but he wasn't wrong. We set out into the mountains, the air crisp with early autumn. The leaves were starting to turn, the kind of gold and rust red that makes the hillsides glow as if they're lit from within. My pack felt like a small child clinging to my back, but I trudged along, determined to prove that every ounce was worth it. By mid-afternoon, we reached a clearing near a creek. It was the kind of spot that almost felt staged. Flat ground for tents, water trickling just loud enough to lull you to sleep, and tall pines standing like watchmen on the edges. When it came time to set up camp, though, my essentials began to feel less essential. The stove wouldn't light because the little fuel canister had sprung a leak somewhere along the trail. The folding saw bound up on every branch I tried to cut, the teeth dull after only a couple strokes. The rope got hopelessly tangled in the pack and ended up more of a nuisance than anything else. By sunset, I was muttering under my breath, surrounded by gear that had either failed me or seemed more trouble than it was worth. Dave, meanwhile, had pulled out 3 simple things: a decent knife, a reliable lighter, and his old cast iron skillet. With those alone, he got a fire going, cut up some food and fried up potatoes and sausage that smelled so good my stomach practically roared. I sat there glaring at my useless gadgets while he flipped his dinner like a campfire chef. He didn't say, "I told you so," but the smirk on his face said plenty. I ended up using exactly 3 items from my overstuffed pack that night: my sleeping bag, my headlamp, and, ironically, the one thing Dave didn't bring: a water filter. The rest sat untouched in a sad little pile by my tent. It was humbling sitting there by the fire with my friend, the smell of pine and wood smoke in the air, realising that all my careful planning and all my gear hadn't really made the trip better. If anything, they weighed me down and gave me headaches. The next morning, I woke up stiff and sore, not from the ground, but from hauling that overloaded pack the day before. The fire was just a circle of grey ash and faint smoke, and Dave was already crouched by the creek, rinsing out the skillet with a handful of sand. The air was sharp and cool, carrying the smell of pine needles, damp with dew. Birds were calling from every direction, an orchestra tuning up while the sun peeked over the ridges. I stretched, rubbed my neck, and glanced over at the pile of gear I'd lugged all this way. It looked ridiculous now, like a garage sale dumped into the woods. Dave noticed my stare and chuckled. "You know," he said, flicking water from the pan, "if you keep dragging all that stuff around, the bears are going to think you're opening a sporting goods store." I laughed, but there was a sting to it because I could already feel the lesson pressing down on me. Still, pride's a stubborn thing, and I wasn't about to admit he was right. At least, not yet. We packed up and hiked further along the creek. The trail wound through a thick grove of aspens, their leaves trembling like 1,000 tiny coins in the breeze. My pack shifted with every step, straps biting into my shoulders. Every so often, I had to stop, pull it off, and adjust things. Meanwhile, Dave moved like water down the trail, his lighter load swinging easily behind him. He whistled as he walked, the sound carrying above the gurgle of the creek. By noon, the sun was hot enough to make the pack unbearable. I dropped it at a bend in the creek, where the water fanned out into a pool and splashed my face with the icy flow. Dave was already fishing, a short rod in hand, a piece of worm dangling from the hook. He caught 2 trout within minutes, tossing them onto a flat rock with a grin. I pulled out one of my essentials, a collapsible fishing pole that looked like something out of a catalogue. After 10 frustrating minutes of untangling line and fiddling with a jammed reel, I gave up and just watched him cook his catch over the fire he started with 2 strikes of his lighter. When he slid a piece of trout onto a forked stick and handed it to me, I couldn't help but laugh. "All right, I admitted between bites. Maybe 20 essentials is overkill. He grinned and raised his own stick like a toast. 3's plenty if you pick the right 3. That afternoon we lingered by the creek, full-bellied and lazy, and I felt the tension of all that wasted gear loosen from my shoulders. The wilderness didn't care how prepared I thought I was, only how present I could be. And somehow, in the quiet shade of those aspens, I started to understand that lesson. By the 3rd day, the mountains decided to test us. Clouds began to gather just after breakfast, heavy and grey, rolling in from the west like a slow tide. The wind shifted first, carrying a chill that made the hairs on my arms rise. Then came the low rumble, deep and steady, echoing through the valleys. We looked at each other, no words needed. Rain was coming, and likely more than just a drizzle. I dug into my mountain of essentials, eager to finally prove their worth. Out came a fancy tarp system, complete with reflective cords, adjustable tensioners, and stakes that looked more like tentacles than tools. It took me the better part of half an hour to rig the thing between 2 pines, the cords tangling around my boots more often than not. Meanwhile, Dave unrolled his simple poncho, tossed another log onto the fire, and started carving shavings from a dry stick he'd split open. "You know," he said, smirking as I wrestled with a knot that refused to hold, "sometimes less really is more." When the storm finally broke, it was as if the sky had tipped a bucket. Rain sheeted down, soaking the forest floor, drumming on leaves, filling the air with that earthy smell only a storm in the mountains can bring. My tarp sagged almost immediately under the weight of water pooling in one corner. I scrambled to adjust it, but every pull on the line only made another section collapse. Within minutes, I was drenched, kneeling in mud, my so-called shelter slumping over like a defeated tent. Dave, on the other hand, sat cross-legged under a pine, poncho draped over him, fire still crackling at his feet. Somehow, he'd managed to keep the flame alive, sheltered beneath a simple lean-to of branches he'd stacked in minutes. I squelched over to him, dripping and miserable, and he just raised an eyebrow. "How's that tarp working out?" I couldn't help it, I laughed, water running down my nose. "It's a swimming pool now," I admitted. We huddled under his makeshift shelter, sipping hot tea he'd brewed in his blackened kettle. The rain pounded on, but the fire hissed and held, and the warmth spread through my soaked clothes. All the gadgets and gear I'd carried seemed laughable now, lying useless in the mud, while 3 simple things kept us dry, warm, and fed. When the storm finally eased, the forest glittered, every leaf dripping silver, every branch glistening in the dim light. The creek swelled with runoff, rushing louder than before. I looked around at the mess of ropes and tarps, then at Dave calmly stoking the fire, and shook my head. "All right," I said, voice low. "I get it now. Less isn't just lighter, it's smarter." Dave only smiled, tossing another log onto the flames. "You're catching on." The morning after that storm felt like the world had been scrubbed clean. Mist clung low over the creek, curling between the trees in pale ribbons. The air was sharp with the smell of wet pine and damp earth, and every step along the trail sent drops cascading from the branches above. My gear, what wasn't ruined by the rain, felt twice as heavy with water. Straps squeaked, zippers stuck, and the tarp, now more of a sodden rag, dripped steadily from where I'd lashed it to my pack. We started hiking again, following the creek uphill as it cut through narrow valleys. The storm had left its mark. Small landslides blocked the trail, roots gleamed slick with moisture, and streams that were ankle-deep the day before now surged and foamed. Each crossing became its own challenge. I fumbled with the idea of using my so-called technical rope, but in truth it was waterlogged, tangled, and smelled faintly of mildew. Dave, meanwhile, simply scouted for fallen logs and hopped across with the balance of a man who trusted his boots more than any fancy gadget. By midday, the trail narrowed into a ravine, the creek roaring beside us, swollen and wild. We reached a crossing where the path all but disappeared into the current. My stomach sank. No way could we wade it without risking being swept away. I dug through my pack again, desperate to justify carrying it. Out came the folding saw, the multi-tool, a bundle of paracord, all of it useless in the face of water rushing too fast to tame. My frustration boiled over, and I dropped everything in the mud with a growl. Dave crouched, studying the creek, then stood and pointed. A giant spruce had fallen downstream, its trunk spanning the gap like a bridge. It wasn't perfect, the bark slick with rain, branches jutting up like spears, but it was passable. Without hesitation, he tested it, planting one boot in front of the other, steadying himself with his knife, held loosely like a counterweight. "Come on," he called, voice nearly lost in the roar of water. My knees locked for a second, heart thumping as I stared at the rushing creek below. But what choice did I have? Clutching my headlamp in one hand, I shuffled forward, arms out wide. The log wobbled beneath me, slick as glass, but step by step I made it across. When my boots finally hit the far bank, I let out a shaky laugh and wiped the sweat from my brow. Dave just grinned. "See? You didn't need 20 items to do that, just guts and balance." I shot him a look, half annoyed, half grateful. He wasn't wrong, again. As we pressed on, the lesson sank deeper with each mile. All that extra weight had never once saved me, but the simple essentials and trust in myself had carried me through. That night, back at camp, the firelight flickered against the trunks of tall pines, and the air was alive with the gentle rush of the creek nearby. My pack sat slumped against a log, muddy, sagging, and stuffed with gear I now saw for what it was, dead weight. The only things I'd truly leaned on the whole trip were the same three I'd dismissed as too simple: my sleeping bag, that trusty headlamp, and the water filter. Everything else was just clutter, metal, and nylon pretending to be useful. Dave sat across from me, stirring the last of the trout in his skillet, the orange glow of the flames dancing in his eyes. He hadn't teased me since the river crossing earlier, but I could feel the smirk just waiting there, hidden behind his calm. I poked at the fire with a stick, thinking about how certain I'd been back in my garage, that every piece of gear had a purpose. Out here, purpose had been stripped bare: warmth, light, clean water, and a way to eat. The rest, well, the forest didn't care how prepared I thought I was. I finally broke the silence. "You know," I said, "when we get back, I think I'm going to sell half that junk." Dave chuckled, flipping the skillet and letting the fire pop. "Half? You'll figure it out. Took me a few trips too." His voice carried that calm certainty of someone who had learned the hard way, who'd already made the same mistakes. As the fire burned low, I stretched out in my bag, headlamp clipped above me on a branch, casting just enough light to make the shadows dance. The forest hummed. Crickets, the creek, a distant owl calling into the night. I thought about the storm, the swollen creek, the endless weight on my back, and how little of it had truly mattered. What stayed with me wasn't the gear, but the moments, laughing at my tarp-turned swimming pool, the taste of fire-cooked trout, the feel of the log shifting under my boots above the rapids. The lesson was as clear as the night sky overhead. In the wilderness, simplicity is strength. The fewer distractions you carry, the more space you leave for the things that truly matter: the fire, the forest, the company of a good friend, and the humbling reminder that nature doesn't bend to your gadgets. As I drifted towards sleep, the embers glowing faintly, I could almost hear the forest whisper its agreement: bring less, live more,